Hello everyone, it's just a real delight to see so many people here. What I've been asked to do is to present some kind of background context on the state of the Church in England and Wales. But I'd just like to begin with some very basic background stats, if you like. So according to the British Social Attitude Survey, which is a very high quality survey that's done every year, not specifically asking questions about religion, that's not why it's funded, but it does ask a couple of questions about religion, which means we've got that data, and we can also look at how these have changed over time. So at present, 8% of the British population say that they are Catholic. If asked, what religion do you consider yourself as belonging to? 52% of the population say that they have no religion. Over time, the British Social Attitude Survey started in 1983. The Catholic population has held remarkably steady over this period, especially when this is the green line. It's hovered around 10%, especially when compared to the Anglican figures, which have really suffered, and the no religion figures, which have really risen more or less in proportion to the decline in the Anglican identity. There's all sorts of reasons why Catholic numbers have held up, but obviously immigration is a very big part of that. Immigration has always been a very big part of that, as many of you will know from your own family histories. But given, as we're about to see, a worryingly large proportion of people who say they were brought up Catholic now no longer identify as Catholic in Britain, then the only way that the Catholic figures have sort of remained relatively steady has been successive waves of immigration from all sorts of different countries. Philippines, Poland, Kerala in India, Ireland, various places. This gives a regional breakdown. Again, the detail isn't particularly important here. The Catholic proportion is the light blue. But the only thing to flag up here particularly is that, again, probably no surprise to anyone, the Northwest is distinctive in terms of its religious breakdown, with particularly high proportions of people who say that they're Catholic. And this is actually particularly relevant because a lot of the national trends that we look at obviously are going to look different depending on region. And the specific Catholic history, heritage, current culture of the Northwest is difficult to find in most other places in the country. Perhaps in Glasgow, perhaps in parts of the Northeast, maybe certain pockets, but the Northwest really does stand out. London is a special case in itself, and a large proportion of the high Catholic population there is immigration specific, though not all. Finally, and this helps to contextualize some of these numbers, basically there are around 3.8 million people in England and Wales who say that they are Catholic when asked. However, there are around 6.2 million people who say that they were brought up Catholic when asked. This is something we're going to go back to, but this really is an important part of our picture when we think about the Catholic community in England and Wales, or Britain, or much of Western Europe, or increasingly in America. A high proportion of people who were brought up Catholic enough to say that, yeah, I was brought up Catholic, and that could mean a huge spectrum of possibilities, from having been baptized and then never having seen a church, apart from maybe at funerals or weddings ever since, to going through Catholic schools, going through sacramental preparation, being confirmed, and then coming later in life to no longer feel Catholic enough even to tick the box. This brings us directly to this. This is the breakdown of the current religious affiliation or identity of Cradle Catholics in Britain. So this is the proportion of people in Britain, which is around 15%, who say that they were brought up Catholic, and around 55% still say that they are Catholic. That's by no means all of those will be practicing or practicing very regularly, but they still feel Catholic enough to tick a box on a survey. Approaching 40% say that they feel that they have no religion. And there's a small 7% who now identify with either a different Christian label or a non-Christian religion. And we can flip this, because it's one thing to know about who was brought up Catholic and how they now regard themselves. It's also interesting to think about the people who do now regard themselves as Catholic and how they were brought up. So this tells us the proportion of current Catholics who are converts, essentially. So 92% of people who currently say that they are Catholic in the country also say that they were brought up Catholic. So 92% of Catholics are Cradle Catholics. Around 6.5% say that they were brought up as some other kind of Christian. The majority of those say that they were brought up Church of England, although there's obviously a broad range in there: Methodists, Baptists, Presbyterians, all sorts. And about 0.5% who say they were brought up in a non-Christian religion, and about 1% who say they were brought up with no religion. And this, given the fact that half the population of Britain, and seeming to be rising, say they have no religion, the fact that the Catholic Church doesn't seem to do terribly well in attracting the non-religious to become Catholics, ought to worry us. That said, it is possible. There's at least one person in this room, me, who was brought up with no religion, and who obviously has come to be a Catholic. There's a very strange, providential story as to how that happened, involving Cardinal Newman College being one, all sorts of other pushes and pulls along the way, but it does happen. And it's important to recognize this, because a lot of the statistics and a lot of the research isn't terribly encouraging and positive. And it's important that it isn't, because we need to be realistic, especially in something like the synodal process, which is going to have a very big influence on the future of Catholicism in, as we've seen, probably the most critical area of Catholicism in the country. And being aware of the actual, genuine, real, deep challenges that we have to be facing up to is important. But equally, it's certainly possible to go the other way. And it's certainly possible to be delighted and surprised and overjoyed once you are at the other side of it, which is partly why I'm so keen that we do more of it, because it's been such a joy and such a wonderful blessing to me. And also my wife, who is sort of in the ex-other Christian current Catholic bracket. But essentially, taking those two trends together, a large proportion of Cradle Catholics now no longer identifying as having any religion, and a small proportion of people who were brought up with no religion now identifying as Catholic. For every one person in Britain who has converted to Catholicism, there are 10 people who were brought up Catholic but sort of feel so distant from it that they no longer even tick the box on a survey, let alone practice, let alone believe in anything distinctively Catholic, shall we say. Mass attendance, again, this will probably not come as a great shock to you, but the trend, the national trend, this is the England and Wales and this is the diocesan official own statistics. So what typically happens is that the Sundays in October, there'll be someone at the back of the church with a little clicker, and if done well, at every Mass, and then the average of those 4 totals will be taken, and those figures will get used. There's some wry smiles from parish priests in the room, which suggests that the the rigour of that method isn't necessarily always quite there, but certainly overall the impression that we might take from these figures has been pretty much constant, almost year-on-year decline since around the mid-1960s. Mass attendance was rising up to the mid-1960s. There was a couple of years that aren't in the data, which are quite... It's an annoyance, frankly, because that's quite a critical period. But something happens, that the trend changes, and it's been downward ever since. The difficulty, the book that's coming out soon is trying to solve the conundrum, but the difficulty we have is that actually pretty much everything happened in the mid-1960s. Quite apart from wide social, cultural shifts, this is when the baby boomers start coming of age. This is when there are huge changes, beginnings of changes in moral, cultural norms and mores in society. This is the point at which the first generation of sort of the British working classes, a significant proportion of them get the opportunity to go to university, which, among other things, means that they leave the sort of the habits of home, go off, spend a formative period away, and then probably don't move back to their old neighbourhoods. The other things that happen in this period, of course, are a great deal of change and turbulence around the Second Vatican Council in all sorts of areas of Catholic life. And Humanae Vitae, and a very serious crisis around that, and all kinds of other things. Identifying what the silver bullet was, and in fact there are probably many of them all working together, is a very critical question, but it's the one that the Church has been living with, striving to turn around. We've tried all sorts of stuff. Nothing yet appears to have really turned it around. So in the mid-1960s, there were around probably 2.25 million Catholics in church on a Sunday. By the time we get to 2016, that's the most recent data, you're looking at about around 750,000. That's a big fall. This puts Christian church attendance since 1980, again in a wider context. The detail of this isn't that important, but it's worth noting that in 1980, there were around 4.5 million Christians in church on a Sunday across all the denominations. By the time you get to 2015, there's about, about 2.7 million. Blue is Anglican, and there's obviously been a significant fall in the Anglican church attendance, but the biggest proportional fall is the red, which is the Catholic. In 1980, there was very significant, hundreds of thousands of more Catholics in church than there were Anglicans in church. It's still the case that there are more Catholics in church on a Sunday than Anglicans in a church, but A, the difference is smaller, and B, the absolute numbers of both have gone down a very significant way. And this shows the proportion, since 1990, of people who say that they are currently Catholic and whether they say that they attend Mass at least weekly. And that's the dark black line. So in 1990, around 35 or so % of people who currently said they were Catholic said they attended Mass at least weekly. And if you just focused on all Cradle Catholics, it was around 25%. By the time you get to 2016, it's slightly under 25% of all people who still say they're Catholic, plus the converts, and around 13% of all Cradle Catholics. Again, the direction of travel is not particularly cheering. Finally, and I appreciate you've had a lot of bad news thrown at you. This is the overall numbers of priests from 1950 to 2010. I don't have the numbers for the past decade, nearly. But again, overall priest numbers, the blue is active diocesan priests, the red is religious priests, which it's not always clear in the data whether that includes the retired or not. Numbers peaked around 1960, 1970. There's been a very gradual step decline every decade since. And if we had an age breakdown, we'd probably see that the average age was going up as we went along. Sunday Mass attendance, we've already seen the numbers. Again, this is just England and Wales, and around the same time as we've seen the priest numbers fall, we see Mass attendance fall. Which raises the question as to whether we often talk in terms of a shortage of priests. This is a very simplistic metric, but actually if we look at the number of people actually in church on a Sunday per priest, then actually the current numbers, at least in 2010, 2000, are actually very good. We have fewer priests, but we have even fewer active worshippers. Now, it is not, and any priest in this room will confirm, it's not only the people actually in Mass every Sunday who are, of course, part of the pastoral concern of a priest, and especially in terms of baptisms, marriages, funerals, the number of Sunday worshippers is by no means a very good indication of the actual important, critical work of a priest. Nevertheless, as a very crude metric, priests to practicing Catholics, it's difficult to say that we don't have currently enough priests to go around. What we arguably do have, and it's an awkward thing to have to say, but we arguably have too many churches. The infrastructure this is countrywide, and the infrastructure that we have was built in better times when there were more priests and more parishioners. There have been church closures. Typically these tend to not close but merge, so you keep the church open, and you have one priest looking after two or more. The difficulty that we have is you end up thinning the priests over a number of churches built for more priests, and you end up thinning the worshippers across a number of churches built for more worshippers. And the difficulty then comes is that it's hard for any one priest to really focus their full energies on a parish. Just in terms of sheer practicalities, you've got kind of 3 parish councils, you've got 3 sets of liturgy rotas, you've got 3 communities of people, you've often got several schools, you've got a whole range of, even at the level of admin, let alone pastoral care. But it also becomes very difficult for any one church to feel particularly full, given that you're thinning out the worshippers over the old infrastructure. This is the average number of priests per church, and again, you see that in 1950 there were over 3 priests per church open for public worship in the country. Now, there weren't necessarily 3 priests at every church, but we had a sort of priest doing all sorts of stuff. By the time you get to 2010, there's 1.5 priests per church, and of course, not all of those priests are in active parish ministry for all sorts of reasons. And this is, I was asked only to focus on, not to talk about the Archdiocese of Liverpool particularly, because that's Father Chris, and obviously anyone in this room knows a lot more about it more deeply than I do. But this is an illustration I've often used about Preston, my own hometown, and that's simply to flag up within a 3.5 mile radius of the city centre, there are 15 open Catholic churches. The vast majority of those in the Diocese of Lancaster, although I think some of the ones down here are in Liverpool. And this, you'll know from many of your own communities, all the towns, all the cities around here have lots of Catholic churches. Every little village has its own Catholic church. And no one wants to close churches for every good reason. But one of the big challenges facing the church, not just in this country, but in all sorts of places, is what best to do looking forward. And that's hopefully a question that will be confronted in a very serious, realistic, hopeful, mission-oriented, Christ-centered way over the process of this synod. And just on behalf of Catholics in this country, I just want to thank all of you for participating in this process, because it takes time out of your day. You have to listen to people like me. You do get probably quite a lot of hot pot suppers in this in this process, which is always a bonus. But this is hugely important work, and thank you all for coming.